Hello, Zero Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lain, and this video is coming out as a celebration of our reaching 50,000 subscribers here on YouTube. It's also going to be replacing our introductory videos, the video that we made saying, what is Zero Books? Well, it's an imprint for JHP, which stands for John Hunt Publishing. It's a critical theory imprint, and it was founded by Derick and Mark Fisher. In 2009, Mark Fisher's book Capitalist Realism was published, and since then that book has really set the direction for the whole project, for the whole imprint. Derick and Fisher left in 2014, and I started here in 2015. Since then, we've moved in an even more anti-capitalist direction. But who are we? Well, we're a team of slushpile readers, editors, publicists, podcasters, and most recently, YouTubers. And for the most part, we're all authors ourselves. Now, Danny Scott is the exception. He's just a shit talker and a video production wizard. But Ashley Frawley is the author of the sociology book, The Semiotics of Happiness. Alfie Bown is the author of the theory book, The PlayStation Dreamworld. Derick Varn is the author of the poetry collection, Apocalyptics. And I'm a novelist of books such as After the Saucers Landed and Bash Bash Revolution. Over the last 4 years, we've worked with a lot of authors and published a variety of terrific, and we like to think important books. Some of our most popular and or most important books include The Writing on the Wall, New Work, New Culture, Kill All Normies, and most recently, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. The original manifesto for Zero Books included a line about how our imprint was aimed at overcoming a bland and anti-intellectual culture. More recently, we've said that our aim is to rethink and reinvigorate the left. But lately, I've started imagining our project as aiming at rethinking something less broad and ambiguous as the left, something more specific. I think our project is to rethink critical theory. Sometime between 1923, when the Institute of Social Research was founded by radical Marxist philosophers such as Theodore Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, and today, the purpose of critical theory has changed. It has shifted away from being an attempt to understand the effect of capitalism as a mode of production upon consciousness and culture, and turned into a preserve for post-Marxism, and I think a state of permanent resistance without even the dream of revolution. What is Zero Books about today? What do I want it to be about? Rethinking critical theory. But what would it mean to rethink critical theory? It would probably mean different things for different people. Despite living in a world unified and determined by one form, one primary social relation, we are all of us fragmented and separated across both time and space. For instance, for me, rethinking critical theory would have to start, rather perversely, with the Situationist International. When Debord committed suicide in November of 1994, I was 23 years old and living in Northwest Portland in a studio apartment with my then fiancée. I was weeks away from getting married and wondering just what such a leap into conformity would mean. How would being married change what I intermittently conceived of as my bohemian lifestyle and my writing career? I remember drinking bottles of Henry Weinhard beer on a balcony overlooking a Thriftway parking lot and the house of the now deceased Mayor Vera Katz, and discussing the death of Debord with my friend and best man, Jimmy. I told him that I thought Debord's death was a very bad sign. Debord had once said that modern people, those of us who die in droves on the freeways and in each flu epidemic and in each heat wave, that we all faced a choice: suicide or revolution. To rethink at that moment meant finding out what my place was or could be, It meant finding a model to follow, a hero to try to be, and a theory to understand. I'd chosen to believe in the SI, in the Situationist International, in Guy Debord, and the fact of his failure, his suicide, paradoxically only confirmed my decision. It solidified my choice. Debord's suicide was, after all, romantic, in the fact that I was more concerned about the dim prospects for revolution, the long odds that I thought his death portended, than I was about the catering or writing my vows. Meant that I was a romantic too. Maybe I was even free. In 1994, rethinking critical theory, for me, was nearly impossible. But if it meant anything to me, it meant rereading Society of the Spectacle. It meant recommitting to the idea of one day being the author of something as significant and potentially liberating as his book, as Debord's book. But what does rethinking critical theory mean today, nearly 25 years later? What does it mean for me? In his essay, Theory of the Derive, Debord wrote that in a derive, one or more persons drop their relations, their work and leisure activities, and all their other usual motives for movement and action, and let themselves be drawn by the attractions of the terrain and the encounters they find there. The assumption behind the derive is that cities contain and/or are shaped by psychogeographic forces. But what is psychogeography? What sorts of forces was Debord turning to when he mapped out Paris in 1955? What he wrote was that psychogeography sets for itself the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, whether consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. Debord sought out a path based on imaginary connections. The route was built not on chance, but on feelings, values, and ideologies. I've been an advocate of the practice of the derive, a proponent of such spontaneous radical activity in the past. In 2010, I wandered Portland and then wrote about and filmed my activities. To set out on such a wander again, to repeat the same gesture, might involve risking regression. It could mean that rather than wandering, I am instead standing still. For me, the difficulty arises at the very start. I can't drop my relations, as they're coming along with me on this journey. Instead of creating a psychogeographic map of Southeast Portland, the task on this journey will be to rethink Guy Debord and psychogeography both, in order to make at least a tentative model for rethinking critical theory. The truth about Debord is that his works were a reaction against the Bolsheviks, which isn't surprising. After all, the works of the letterists, surrealists, and Dadaists, his major influences, were themselves reactions to the failure that the First World War represented, a failure that was associated not only with stacks of bodies in trenches and the smell of mustard gas, but also with splits within the Second International, with war credits, and ultimately with the crushing of the January Uprising in 1919, and then the summertime discovery of Rosa Luxemburg's rotting corpse in the Landwehr Canal. As Tristan Tzar once said, the beginnings of Dada were not the beginnings of art, but of disgust. Of course, along with the failure in Germany, the other major calamity that influenced Debord's wandering was the success of the workers' revolution in Russia. As Debord's one-time mentor Cornelius Castoriadis, the editor of the French journal Socialism or Barbarism, and author of The Imaginary Institution of Society, put it in 1964, the world we live in, reflect in, and act in, was launched on its present course by the workers and Bolsheviks of Petrograd in October 1917. Cornelius' explanation for what went wrong in the Soviet Union led him to break not only with Bolshevism and the International Communist Party, but with Marx and Marxism too. In his essay, The Role of Bolshevik Ideology in the Birth of the Bureaucracy, he claimed that the reason for the failure of the Soviet Union was not just that the party took up the power that should have been reserved for the workers themselves. Not only that the Bolsheviks turned Russia not towards socialism but towards state capitalism, but that they did this because of Marx.
All good places must die. All bad places must live on forever.
Castoriadis wrote that the Bolsheviks wanted to modify the economy, but not the relations between people at work or the nature of labor itself. Their philosophy was to develop the forces of production. And here too, they were the faithful inheritors of Marx, or at least one side of Marx, which became the predominant one in his mature writings. And he quoted Trotsky's 1922 reply to Kautsky, the bit wherein Trotsky claimed that under socialist production, a Taylorist system would be deployed in order to increase the volume of social product and consequently to raise the general well-being of the masses. Under socialism, Trotsky wrote, "Those workers who do more for the general interest will receive the right to a greater quantity of the social product than the lazy and the careless and the disorganized." Is this in line with Marx? Not if what Marx wrote in the Critique of the Gotha program should be our guide for understanding socialism. According to Marx's theory, there is a difference between regular, sensuous work and the sort of labor that creates value under capitalism. Regular work creates stuff, whereas abstract labor creates value based on time. The value of society is measured in the hours worked. When imagining how a socialist society would distribute goods, Marx wrote about using a system of labor certificates to pay workers directly for their time, rather than using commodity money as a wage to purchase their labor power, rather than treating the work of people as a commodity. And what this change would mean, according to Marx, was that every worker would get the same certificate based on labor time spent working, regardless of the real differences in the quality of their work or workmanship. That is, Marx did say that labor time would be the basis for organizing distribution and work under socialism, or the first phase of socialism. But he also said that rather than paying workers more if they produced more, under socialism they would receive the same number of certificates for the same number of hours worked, regardless of quality or ability. And the point of such a system would not be to create a fair outcome, but to make the unfairness, the ludicrousness of production based on labor time, plain to see. The aim of increasing the productive forces was not to increase the amount of time spent working, but to increase the creative capacities of everyone so that people could be free. In his book, The Society of the Spectacle, Debord wrote that economic growth frees societies from the natural pressure which required their direct struggle for survival, but at that point, it is from their liberator that they are not liberated. But too much hinges on the word economic here. Debord's reliance on aphorisms has led him astray, led him away from understanding the mediating structure that was and is the real reason behind this, as Postone would put it, treadmill dynamic under capitalism. This dynamic where we increase production, we create tremendous amounts of wealth, and we end up in poverty. The idea that we have to increase the amount of time spent working in order to create abundance is taken for granted. It's reified or hypostatized, or whatever other fancy term you want to use. We can't see past it. Since the time spent working is obviously the source of the value of our things, since this idea is currently the real and material basis for our lives, we head off in other directions. The problem isn't the way we think in relation to the world, but just having ideas themselves. The problem isn't this form of production, but productive activity in the abstract. Instead of seeking a new form of mediation, we seek to get rid of mediation altogether. We want to get rid of the spectacle, to stop playing games, to rid ourselves of fantasies. But maybe playing games is precisely what we're avoiding, because to play the game of history, take responsibility for our freedom, is what, after the failures we've already lived through, we can no longer imagine. When stated plainly, this idea that the task for a socialist is to create a society where labor time no longer determines our social life or the things we produce or the way in which we go about distributing the world amongst ourselves or the products of our labor. It seems very simple. We just need to do something else, right? But the history of the 20th century has demonstrated that it's actually very difficult. It's a very hard problem to come up with a new mediating structure. But still, I think today that is still the project. And if we're going to rethink critical theory today, what we should do is hold that idea of the labor theory of value in mind. The critique from Marx is already there for us. He has already described the world. What's left for us to do is to change it. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.